Good morning, and thank you for joining this panel on civil liberties in a crisis. I'm Silkie Carlo, the Director of Civil Liberties Campaign Group Big Brother Watch, and I'm honoured to be joined this morning by fabulous barrister and human rights expert Kirsty Brimelow, Guardian journalist Damien Gayle, and the former minister now leading rebellion against the excesses of government's rule by decree, Steve Baker. Over the past 6 months, Britain has experienced the greatest loss of liberty in a generation. The whole nation was put under house arrest and freedom of movement was suspended and still is for millions of people. Elections have been suspended, protests have been criminalised, and we're now faced with a new dawn of biosecurity. Yet, as the population pays the price in liberty, thousands of lives have been lost in underserved care homes, whilst emergency care easements have left the most vulnerable people adrift, and key workers are still struggling to get the PPE and tests that they need. The balance between citizens and the state has been capsized, and even the balance between Parliament and the government, a government elected on a mandate to give back control to Parliament to make laws, has been toppled. Emergency powers are always sold on the premise of being strictly necessary and temporary, yet the government chose not to use the Civil Contingencies Act, but rather to impose more permanent legislation through the Coronavirus Act and a sprawling network of hundreds of statutory instruments governing every aspect of our lives, from how many people can sit in our gardens to the decibels of noise that a bar or restaurant can play. The question is, how can we and how will we restore the balance and prevent permanent damage to liberty, democracy, and the rule of law in Britain? I'm going to ask each of our guests to give 2 minutes of their initial reflections on this question, and we'll start with Kirsty.
Thank you very much, Silkie. Well, looking at the title, Civil Liberties in Crisis, reminded me of Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher, when he considered a world of an all-powerful government. And the fundamental, of course, of authoritarian rulers is that power is centralized, and the theory behind it is that without absolute governance, there will be acute civil disorder. And of course, Hobbes's theory of government was based on a theory of society, which in itself is based on a theory of human nature. And what we're seeing with the laws and the amendments to the laws, the regulations, is perhaps a small group of people's perception of how people will behave unless they're governed by criminalization, by punishment, by law. Now, Hobbes, of course, concluded the very famous quote that probably a lot of people in this audience will know, is that a world without laws means that the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But of course, what we've seen is that laws themselves aren't a solution. And in fact, they can be part of the problem if they are not just, if they are not clear, and if they are not accessible in substance and application. And over the last 6 months, not only have we seen people confused, but we've seen the ministers responsible for the laws that have been brought into force confused. And the amount of times I've literally been shouting at news programmes where ministers have been wrongly stating what the new law and power is. And so how are the public meant to regulate themselves if those actually, including the Secretary of State for Health, and then latterly the Secretary of State, Priti Patel, cannot get it right and explain what the laws are. And sadly, it isn't a joke, because this is having a real impact upon people's lives. Now, very briefly, there are the Health Protection Coronavirus England regulations. There's similar regulations for the other 3 nations. They are the regulations that prohibit freedom of movement, aspects of our family life. There's secondary legislation, and they come under the Public Health Act 1984. In order for them to be virus, i.e. for them themselves to be lawful, they need to fall within the purpose of the Public Health Act, which is preventing, protecting against, controlling, or providing a public health response to the incidence or spread of infection or contamination. If they are outside that, such as being used in a public order sort of way, then they are ultra vires, and they are liable then to be quashed. I have about 10 seconds remaining, so I'm going to just push on through with the points I want to make, which are these. The latest amendments, which came in at the weekend, 1 minute after midnight, Sunday night stroke Monday morning, show that we have now moved to regulations which are ultra vires or potentially ultra vires. For example, we now have offences of fining an employee if the employee does not notify their employer within a particular time frame that they are self-isolating. How is that helping the spread of prevent the spread of the virus? That's the question. We also have a new offence here for somebody who knowingly gives false information about somebody else. And obviously that is an example of where the informing on your neighbour has been shown to backfire. But again, how is that within the purpose of the Public Health Act? We've also seen a massive increase in fines. I remember when the regulations came into force, the 26th of March, 2020, we were looking at £60 fines. Now we're starting at £1,000 and up to 10,000. Coronavirus has struck in different ways. As well as the devastation it's reaped in taking people's lives, it's cleared a road for the government to emasculate the rule of law. And this places us on a far more dangerous road than the one to Barnard Castle.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Next, Damien, can you give your reflections?
Yeah, so I cover policing and protests for The Guardian. Over the past 2 weekends, I've watched as the police used violence to break up political protests on the basis that they were breaking the coronavirus regulations. On the most recent, on Saturday afternoon just past, the Met said it had decided to break up this protest, which involved probably tens of thousands of people, on the basis that Trafalgar Square was so full that people could no longer adhere to social distancing rules. The commander said this had voided the organizers' risk assessment, meaning it was no longer covered by an exemption that's supposed to allow for political protests. The police then moved in and they used their batons to break up the crowds in, and I'm quoting, in the interests of public safety. But it didn't end up being very safe for the people who got cracked in the head by the police. Whatever you think about the aims of the protests, and frankly, some of the people who are involved in organizing them and joining them have got some quite batshit views. These people should have had a right to protest. There was no threatening behavior, there was no damage to property, and the role of the police ought to have been to facilitate that right, not to deny it. And if some of those genuinely believe that the royal family are lizards from space, or that Donald Trump is waging a secret war to rescue children locked up in tunnels underneath the major capitals of the world, there were a lot of others who went along because they had a sense that something wasn't right with the powers that the state has assumed to deal with the pandemic. I think even beyond those who join the protests, there's a growing sense, there's a growing constituency of people who have a sense that the government response has become excessive. Set against them, there is still a huge proportion of people who believe that given the seriousness of the pandemic, no government intervention can be too draconian. And this is where I think we have a problem. While there are people who've developed legitimate lines of questioning over the pandemic, there is not much of a sensible popular movement to channel and articulate their concerns. So people are connecting on Facebook and they're sharing conspiracy theories, and they're finding their concerns articulated by people like David Icke or Piers Corbyn, who variously believe that the virus doesn't exist, or that it's activated by face masks, or that injections of mistletoe can cure cancer, or on all kinds of other kind of weird ideas about public health. So the question is, where do we go from here? And I think part of the problem is that we need to try and develop a mass kind of sensible mass movement of people who can articulate these concerns about the increasing totalitarian nature of the way the government is behaving, and can channel some of this sense that people have that something is not right about what's going on at the moment. I know that there are organizations like yours, Silkie, Big Brother Watch, who've been doing work to try and raise awareness of the lack of oversight of the laws that have been passed and some of the worst consequences of them. But we need to try and find a way to cut through to these people who on the ground genuinely feel that there's something weird about not being able to have more than 6 people in their home and yet being able to go down to the pub, and can see these contradictions and want to try and find some way to go back to the freedoms that we had before.
Thank you, and I very much hope Big Brother Watch can be that mass movement that is so needed at the moment. And finally, Steve Baker.
Good morning, everybody. And first, a big thank you to the Spectator for making this possible. A huge thank you to Big Brother Watch for everything you've done to support us in Parliament. Thanks for the T-shirt as well. And I should just acknowledge Liberty and say thanks to Liberty as well. So we all know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And yet here we stand wandering down the road to hell, looking around us, and altogether too few people are raising concerns about what's happening with parliamentary democracy and the rule of law. So I'm really thrilled that we're here. I'm definitely on the right panel, having listened to the other panelists. I said something on Ridge which felt very risky at the time. I said, how do people think that liberty dies? Well, it dies like this. And I meant that sincerely, and it seems actually to have landed quite well. People do realise that parliamentary scrutiny of the law, retrospective scrutiny and so on is in great trouble. And people realise that the rule of law is in great trouble. That's a point I'll perhaps come back to in a moment. What I wanted to say was something about the forces which I think are at work, because only by understanding what the forces are at work can we do something about them. So I'm going to talk about the people I know best first, politicians. What is it that politicians want? Well, they want power. We all know that. The crucial thing about politicians and power is they trust themselves to wield it. Politicians trust themselves to wield power. And I have to say, having been a minister, you know, officials trust themselves to wield power too. They're quite comfortable with having power through regulations because, of course, they all know one another. They're jolly good chaps, and, you know, they know their motivations and so forth. But much as I trust the good faith of members of the cabinet who I'm now privileged to say that I know personally, it's not one of the principles of a free society that we should have the rule of those in authority and allow our lives and the rules on which our lives depend to be set by individuals and their discretion. But that is the direction in which I'm afraid we have been pushed by necessity, and people will know the old quote about it being the plea for every infringement of human liberty. So politicians and officials trust themselves to wield power, but we don't want to rely on their good faith. So who's going to hold them to account? Well, first of all, let's say something about this Parliament. I don't want to be too partisan. It is, of course, conference season, and that means during the course of this debacle, the other parties perhaps a bit distracted, but the poor Liberal Democrats are in such a state going through their conference. Well, where are they? They're absent. Well, I can understand why they're absent, but I would say to anybody watching this who supports the Liberal Democrats, please do encourage them to get stuck in on these issues, because if the Liberal Democrats don't stand for liberty and the rule of law, I think the question starts to answer itself. The Labour Party, of course, the Labour Party do believe in state power. They do believe in collective action to further the safety and security of people and collectively, but I think that's leaving them at something of a disadvantage, a point perhaps I'll come back to, have time to talk about rights for a moment. The SNP have a great conception of their entitlements, their rights, but only in relation to independence, it seems to me. And I would really love for the SNP to rise to the challenge of scrutinising the rule of law in this government. Now, that then turns to my own party. So something's going on in my own party. With a majority of 80, it's conventionally thought that most politics has shifted to the cabinet table. Because, of course, once the cabinet's decided, usually you would find that the cabinet would get its way. So what's just happened in the last week or so is a rebellion has grown from 40. I tabled the motion with 40 names on it very deliberately. And now, you know, I would say the reports in the press of about 80 are accurate as far as I'm concerned. So that's an absolutely huge rebellion. We can't keep holding the government to account like this. My party simply won't do it. So we need the opposition to come back, and that's why I've touched on it. But for the moment, here we are. So just say a word about my own party. Most of my colleagues in Parliament are pragmatists. Some are neoconservatives. That means they're very comfortable with the use of power as long as it's them using it. by wood to a bridge. And then there's people like me, classical liberals, very sceptical of power. But somehow we've just formed a big coalition of members of parliament from all three of those groups to say, actually, this has gone too far. I'm afraid I haven't got the time in front of me, Silkie, so I'm going to go on until you tell me to stop. I do think that we've got a problem with the prevailing mainstream. If I may, I'll quote Karl Popper, because I was just rummaging on my website. I see now more clearly than ever before that even our greatest troubles spring from something that is as admirable and sound as it is dangerous, from our impatience to better the lot of our fellows. And of course, he was writing that in the context of the chaos of the first half of the 20th century. I think we need to be really careful right now in our consideration of rights, that we don't confuse freedoms from and freedoms to. That is, we don't confuse those rights on which our freedom rests with entitlements to things which perhaps are not universal and reciprocal. Because I think one of the factors at work here is that people who ordinarily would stand up for civil liberties are actually a bit confounded because the state is acting for the betterment of the public. And that is, in a sense, disarming lawyers. And I'd be really interested in lawyers' feedback on that. It's a nascent thought, but I'm quite concerned. Where are the civil liberties lawyers you would normally expect to hold government to account? Where is the opposition? And I think with that, I will probably pause. There's much else I could say, but I really appreciate being here and I hope we'll flesh all these issues out.
Thank you so much. Kirsty, I'm going to come to you to ask if you can respond to that. And also if you can just spell out very briefly for anyone who might not have thought very much about this issue, exactly what the dangers are of living in a country that has emasculated or really abandoned the rule of law.
Yeah, thank you. With the query, where are all the lawyers? I suppose you kind of get within your own bubble on that. And so, I mean, I brought the first judicial review against the regulations on the prohibition on the right to manifest religion. So that was in April. So it was actually it was pretty quick. It was only it was actually the last week in Ramadan. But it didn't get much publicity. So although there was a number of press who were aware of it, I think it's a good question from my perspective. From where I am at Doughty Street, we've never been busier with these cases, and also I found that working with NGOs such as Big Brother Watch, where we've actually, and we also put a team together of lawyers to deal with all the fixed penalty notices that are occurring. So it might be there's quite a lot going on, but we're not really publicising it. I've got a case of a JR, for example, at the moment against a fixed penalty notice, and we actually, I think we can take some credit with the Times newspaper on causing the CPS to review every single one of its charges brought under the coronavirus laws. And that was after a very strong public campaign where literally I was looking at the cases which the Times were alerting me to. And then we worked with Big Brother Watch, where there was clearly something wrong with the prosecutions. And I was saying, yes, that one's unlawful, that one's unlawful. I didn't even need to go into court. It was being published in the Times. And then the next day they were setting aside the convictions. So that was completely novel. But I take your point, you always need more. And I also would support what you say about we need the other political parties. And what I haven't understood myself is why for 6 months, there have been laws which have been issued by decree, which comes onto the second part of your question, Silkie, that laws go through Parliament, they're scrutinised by Parliament. Now, it's not perfect, but there's checks and balances in there and there's questions that are asked. And it's understandable at the beginning of the pandemic that you're using emergency legislation, but it's not understandable 6 months in, or even in fact, 1 month in, I think. And so that until yesterday, there has not been any murmur or objection from any political party as to why we are being governed by decree. And his legal historians will know that the last time perhaps that happened was back in the time of King Charles I. The law is really important because if you don't have equal distribution of the law, if you don't have legitimacy is a fairness flaw. If laws become arbitrary, they become disproportionate, then what always happens is the most vulnerable in society will be the ones who are the most impacted. Those in minority groups, we've seen some worrying statistics as well concerning the issue of fixed penalty notices. I know Big Brother Watch done a lot of work on this, as has Liberty. And so we're already seeing that coming through. And if you don't have a robust legal system, which is has got all the checks and balances within it and the safeguards within it, again, with the regulations from fixed penalty notices, there's no right of appeal. And you've got, on the one hand, you've got the Folks review ongoing. Why do we have so many judicial reviews? And then you've got legislation brought in by the government, which gives you no mechanism to appeal other than to use a judicial review.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of issues there when the law is brought in this way. The other final thing I would say is, when you have a mashup of messages from the government and guidance, and then that's confused with law, that in itself weakens the law itself, because the police have been, we've seen it happen many, many times, and I've been involved in many cases where the police have just mixed up guidance, thinking that's the law, with the law itself. And so that any confusion, anything on distorting clarity, accessibility, basically leads to chaos.
And this has really confounded the public, hasn't it? Damien, I was wondering if, from your experience of covering some of the backlash to this, in particular the protest, you sensed a change in public mood. I mean, it certainly seems to me that back in April, to declare yourself as anti-lockdown meant one thing, but now actually that probably applies to a much greater portion of the public, because we're not in that initial stage of not understanding the virus, of emergency legislation. I think people do have the sense that they're living in something akin to a dictatorship, maybe strong, but certainly rule by decree without doubt. What was your perception of that and of the public mood at the moment?
I think that's right. I think that there were people who were always going to oppose this no matter what. But I did find from a lot of the people who I spoke to that they admitted to me that, just like everyone else, when the pandemic first broke, they were dutifully staying in their homes. When they were out, they were making a wide berth to avoid people. But as they'd seen things progress, and particularly as they'd seen predictions like the prediction of the potential death toll given by Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, that we could have, I think he said 500,000 deaths in the UK, things like that not come to pass. And then obviously Ferguson's famous liaisons with his lover at the height of lockdown. Seeing those hypocrisies from the people who are supposed to be in charge of implementing these laws, I think has had a big impact on people. But also seeing that when this all began back in January, we were watching videos and social media from Wuhan, and it looked like the apocalypse was basically on its way. And then in Italy, we saw those famous photographs of intensive care units totally overrun with patients. And we saw the huge mobilization that our government made to bring in all of the Nightingale hospitals and to try and import personal protective equipment from around the world. And in the case of the Nightingale hospitals, at least, it seemed that they were not needed. They never really admitted any patients. And I think people then began to become quite skeptical about what the government was telling them. And then once we all got the all clear and were told to leave our homes and told in no uncertain terms to go back to work and to put our children back in school and to eat out to help out and to start going back to the pub and getting back on public transport, for that message to then be reversed, as it has been in the past week or so, that has further muddied the waters for a lot of people. And I think that's possibly part of the reason why a lot of people have started to become skeptical about what the government is telling them. I mean, obviously there's a huge constituency of people who never believe what the government tells them anyway. Sometimes you could say that's with potentially good reason, but I do feel that the numbers on these protests have grown from the first one on the 29th of August. That was a big protest, but I think there was slightly more on the one on Saturday. And if you had combined the one on Saturday with the one the week before, then obviously lots of people weren't able to make it to both. Then I think there's a really large growing movement against this.
It's a serious movement growing against it, and I think that's reflected somewhat in the newspapers as well. Steve, you made a point about power and power trusting, people in power trusting themselves to wield that power. Of course, Boris Johnson is a self-proclaimed liberal, and yet he's standing over this extraordinary, as Kirsty puts it, emasculation of the rule of law, rule by decree, let alone a lot of other things going on in the background with digital IDs, facial recognition. Really, in many senses, we're seeing one of the most draconian governments that we've seen in a very long time. Do you think this is a fundamental problem with power itself and something rotten in the political system? Or what's the political solution to this?
Well, Silkie, I there's so much as a practical politician I want to challenge in what you've said, but I'll answer your question directly.
We haven't got time.
We haven't got time. Look, I am an all-round classical liberal in my outlook, moderated by pragmatism that comes from being a practical politician. But if we live in an age, as I think we do, where the general assumption in the media and in the minds of the public very often, the most prevailing assumption seems to be that the state has omnipotent agency. It can do anything. It's if only ministers were competent enough. Well, if that's the assumption, and it's very rare, people talk about partiality in the media and so on. I can't remember the last time I was asked, why do you think the government needs to do that? Don't you think that we should leave room for civil society, families and individuals in that area? This is not a question which gets asked. The assumption is always that the state should do more, whatever the question, that the state should do more. And the only problem that's going wrong is the incompetence of ministers. And I'm afraid this is not very realistic. I'm an old English liberal for a reason, and that's because I don't think power is the best way to organise society. So I've long argued, and we haven't possibly got time to go through it here, that we are in the midst of a developing crisis of political economy since the end of the Second World War. The two world wars, I believe, were an ideological wars of transformation from classical liberalism to let's call it interventionism rather than offend social democrats, but I've done it now. But we're in the crisis of this belief that the state can do everything, and it's really come to a head in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. So that is, I think, the issue. If we can persuade people to be liberal in all things, and that means freedom from coercion, perhaps I'm afraid difficult thing for a politician to approach living with a bit more virtue. Well, maybe we'd start to make progress as a society, but I think we should challenge the fundamental assumption that state power, that is coercion of people, is the answer to all of our difficulties. I firmly believe that it is not.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it seems that coercion has been used to make up for sometimes what's been lacking in the state's ability to do other things, such as providing testing and other kinds of really management questions rather than political questions.
Yeah, and if I may, because you've provoked me, there's been this assumption that people can be forced to comply. There's that dreadful Spy M document that you've put out about people's sense of personal risk needing to be increased. But if you look at the King's College research, there's an enormous gap, it seems, between people's intention to comply and what they actually do. This raises a really dangerous question. If the public is something of an immovable object, is the government really going to keep on applying ever greater degrees of force until it's irresistible? This is not where our society should be headed. So I wonder, I've previously floated that we should move on to a voluntary basis. That would be a very serious step because this continues to be a very dangerous disease for those vulnerable to it. But, I think if we want to be a virtuous and free society, we've got to re-establish parliamentary democracy and the rule of law. That raises profound questions for the basis of these rules.
Just for anyone that may not know exactly what Steve was referring to there, I think you're referring to documents showing the government's strategy to increase fear in communications.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, which a lot of people have remarked on and been accused of just sort of baseless speculation, but that is certainly the case. That is a strategy. Kirsty and then Damien, can you just briefly respond to Steve's point? Do you think one way to protect civil liberties in this crisis would be to manage this through strict guidance and information and support rather than the kind of hard edge of the law?
Yes, I would be in favour of an accessible instrument of facts, scientific, easily accessible scientific facts, not a press conference with scientists flanked by politicians and press asking questions. And actually many countries, I do a lot of work in Colombia, and it's a constitutional case actually established the right of people to have the facts on which they can then base their decisions and regulate their own conduct. I think that would, so people can understand the purpose. Secondly, we need to stop potentially criminalizing people. This destroys people's lives. Fining people at these times of extreme stress as well it is setting up divisions within society. It's also, we can't simply blame the police either because they're confused, and you're always going to get overzealous officers misapplying the law, even if the vast majority are doing their absolute best. And we've seen that happening. So you need to remove that power which is within these regulations, put it in guidance. I completely agree with Steve on, we are a liberal democracy. We are not, again, I'm going to refer to some of the countries in Latin America where I work, such as Colombia. We are not one of these states which does crack down, and we are moving towards crackdown. And that is not the sort of society that over hundreds of years that we have fought for those freedoms and protections to now be dragged back to. It is a serious pandemic, but there are different ways of approaching it to try and save people's lives, but at the same time protecting the core of how we actually live our lives. We shouldn't sacrifice that, which is what unfortunately I think is happening in the moment.
Thank you. And Damien, can you give your response to that in just 10 seconds? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the government has a lot of work to do to try and overcome some of the cynicism that's emerged. I think an impartial source of evidence would be really helpful, but we have to somehow fight back against the conspiracy theorists who have somehow seized control of the narrative.
Well, there is certainly a lot to go through here, and I think there are some of the concerns that people have are extreme, but extreme concerns are well-founded at the moment. We're talking about the emasculation and the loss of the rule of law. We're talking about the greatest suspension of liberty that we've ever had. And we're seeing massive public pushback. And if we live in a democracy, then we have to respond to that. And we need our MPs to respond to it. So tomorrow is a really big day with the renewal of the Coronavirus Act motion. Of course, we'll be watching very closely to see what happens. And I hope that some of this discussion plays into some of our thinking about how we get back, where we are and how we get back to some kind of state of normality. So please follow us all on Twitter. We're all there. Follow Big Brother Watch. Thanks again to the Spectator for having us, and thank you for joining us.